To stick to our example, the application of new machine tools may, in absolute terms, shorten the working period necessary for the production of a locomotive. But if improved processes in spinning increase the finished product turned out daily or weekly here to an even greater extent, then the length of the working period in machine building will still have increased relatively, compared with that in spinning. Chapter 13. Production time. Working time is always production time, i.e. time during which capital is confined to the production sphere. But it is not true, conversely, that the entire time for which capital exists in the production process is necessarily therefore working time. What is at issue here are not interruptions in the labor process conditioned by the natural limits of labor power itself, even though we have seen the extent to which the mere fact that fixed capital, factory buildings, machinery, etc., lies idle during the pauses in the labor process became one of the motives for the unnatural extension of the labor process and for working day and night. Asterisk. What is involved is rather an interruption independent of the length of the labor process, an interruption conditioned by the nature of the product and its production, during which the object of labor is subjected to natural processes of shorter or longer duration, and has to undergo physical, chemical or physiological changes while the labor process is either completely or partially suspended. After grapes have been pressed, for instance, the wine must go through a period of fermentation, and then also rest for a while before it reaches a certain degree of readiness. In many branches of industry the product must undergo a process of drying, as in pottery, or else be exposed to certain conditions in order to change its chemical properties, as with bleaching. Winter corn needs 9 months or so to ripen. Between seed time and harvest, the labor process is almost completely interrupted. In the raising of timber, once planting and the preliminary work connected with this is completed, the seed may need 100 years to be transformed into a finished product. During this whole time, only a relatively very insignificant intervention of labor is needed. In all these cases, additional labor is added only occasion AHY for a large part of the production time. The situation described in the see Volume 1, Chapter 10, 4. Production time 317 Vias chapter, where additional capital and labor has to be added to capital already tied up in the production process, occurs here only with interruptions of a greater or lesser extent. In all these cases, therefore, the production time of the capital advanced consists of two periods, a period in which the capital exists in the labor process, and a second period in which its form of existence, that of an unfinished product, is handed over to the sway of natural processes, without being involved in the labor process. This situation is not altered if the two periods of time occasionally cut across one another or are interspersed. Here the working period and the production period do not coincide. The production period is longer than the working period. But it is only after the production period has been left behind that the product is finished and mature, and e'en thus be transformed from the form of productive capital into that of commodity capital. The turnover period is then extended according to the length of that part of the production time that does not consist of working time. In so far as this time of production over and above the labor time is not determined by natural laws given once and for all, as with the ripening of corn, the growth of an oak, etc., the turnover period can often be shortened to a greater or lesser extent by the artificial shortening of the production time. Examples of this are the introduction of chemical in place of open-air bleaching, and more effective drying apparatus in the drying processes. In tanning, the penetration of tannic acid into the skins, which used to take between 6 and 18 months with the old method, only takes 1.5 to 2 months with the new method involving the use of the air pump. J.D. Courcelle Senoy, Traité théorique et pratique des entreprises industrielles, etc., Paris, 1857, 2nd ed., po. 49. The most far-reaching example of artificial shortening of a production time made up exclusively of natural processes is given by the history of iron production over the last 100 years, from the invention of puddling in 1780 to the modern Bessemer process and the latest procedures introduced since then. The production time has been enormously curtailed, but the application of fixed capital has also increased to the same extent. A peculiar example of the divergence between production time and working time is provided by the American manufacture of shoe lasts. Here a significant part of the expense arises from the wood having to dry out in store for up to 18 months, so that the finished lasts do not warp. During this time, the wood does not undergo any other labor process. The turnover period of the capital applied is therefore 318. The turnover of capital not only determined by the time required to produce the lasts themselves, but also by the time for which the capital has to lie idle in the shape of wood which is being dried out. The capital exists in the production process for 18 months before it can enter the labor process proper. This example also shows how the turnover times of various parts of the total circulating capital may differ as a result of circumstances that arise from the production sphere and not from the circulation sphere. The distinction between production time and working time is particularly important in agriculture. In our temperate climates, the land brings forth grain once a year. The shortening or lengthening of the production period, an average of 9 months for winter sowing, is itself dependent on the alternation of good and bad years, and hence cannot be precisely determined in advance and controlled, as in industry proper. Only subsidiary products such as milk, cheese, etc. can be produced and sold continuously in short periods. But the working time is in the following quite different situation. The number of working days for the 3 main working periods is assumed to be as follows in the different districts of Germany, with respect to the climatic and other conditions involved. The spring period from mid-March or the beginning of April up to the middle of May, 50 to 60 days. The summer period from early June to late August, 65 to 80 days. The autumn period from early September to the end of October or middle or late November, 55 to 75 days. As far as winter goes, there is simply the work suited to that period, such as haulage of fertilizer, wood, goods for market, building materials, etc. F. Kirchhoff, Handbuch der Landwirtschaftlichen Betriebslehre, Dessau, 1852, page 160. Thus, the more unfavorable the climate, the more the agricultural working period, and hence the outlay of capital and labor, is compressed into a short interval, as for example in Russia. In some of the northern districts, field labor is only possible during from 130 to 150 days in the course of the year, and it may be imagined what a loss Russia would sustain, if out of 65 million of her European population, 50 million remained unoccupied during 6 or 8 months of winter, when all agricultural labor is at a standstill. Beside the 200,000 peasants who work in Russia's 10,500 factories, particular cottage industries have grown up everywhere in the villages. There are villages, for instance, in Russia in which all the peasants have been for generations either weavers, tanners, shoemakers, locksmiths, cutlers, etc. This is particularly the case in the gubernias of Moscow, Vladimir, Kaluga, Kostroma and St. Petersburg. These cottage industries, INSI, production time 319 dentally, are already being pressed more and more into the service of capitalist production. For example, merchants supply the weavers with warps and weft, either directly or by intermediate agents. Abbreviated from reports by HM Secretaries of Embassy and Legation, on the Manufactures, Commerce etc., Number 8, 1865, pp. 86, 87. We see here how the distinction between production period and working period, with the latter forming only a part of the former, constitutes the natural basis for the unification of agriculture with rural subsidiary industries, just as these, in turn, are points of vantage for the capitalist, who first intrudes in his capacity as merchant. In so far as capitalist production later manages to complete the separation between manufacture and agriculture, the rural worker becomes ever more dependent on merely accidental subsidiary employments and his condition thereby worsens. As far as capital is concerned, as we shall see later on, all these differences in the turnover balance out. Not so for the worker. In most branches of industry proper, as well as in mining, transport, etc., production proceeds evenly in the same working time as work year in year out. Apart from fluctuations of price, disturbances of business, etc. and abnormal interruptions, the outlay of capital going into the daily circulation process is evenly distributed. While market conditions remain the same, therefore, the reflux or renewal of circulating capital is distributed over the whole year in equal portions. However, in those investments of capital where working time forms only one part of the production time, there is great unevenness in the outlay of circulating capital in the course of the different periods of the year, inasmuch as the reflux only follows, at one stroke, at a time prescribed by natural conditions. On a given scale of business, therefore, with the same volume of circulating capital advanced, this must be advanced in larger amounts at once, and for a longer time, than in those businesses with continuous working periods. The life of fixed capital is significantly different here from the time in which it actually functions productively. With this difference between working time and production time, the time during which the fixed capital is utilized is of course constantly interrupted for a longer or shorter interval, in agriculture for instance, with the use of draft cattle, implements and machines. In so far as this fixed capital consists of draft animals, it continues to require the same or almost the same outlay on fodder, etc. as during the time in which it operates. In the case of dead means of labor, non-use also gives rise to a certain depreciation. The product thus always becomes dearer, since the transfer of value to the product is not calculated AC. 320 the turnover of capital according to the time for which the fixed capital functions, but rather according to the time in which it loses value. In these branches of production it is a condition of normal use that fixed capital should lie idle, whether or not this still involves running costs, just as in spinning a condition of normal use is the loss of a certain quantity of cotton, and in the same way, in every labor process, the labor power expended unproductively, but unavoidably so under normal technical conditions, counts just as much as the productive. Every improvement that reduces the unproductive expenditure of means of labor, raw materials and labor power also reduces the value of the product. In agriculture the two things are combined, the long duration of the working period and a great difference between working time and production time. Hodgkin correctly notes on this point, the difference of time, although he does not differentiate here between working time and production time, required to complete the products of agriculture, and of other species of labor, is the main cause of the great dependence of the agriculturists. They cannot bring their commodities to market in less time than a year. For that whole period they are obliged to borrow of the shoemaker, the tailor, the smith, the wheelwright, and the various other laborers, whose products they cannot dispense with, but which are completed in a few days or weeks. Owing to this natural circumstance, and owing to the more rapid increase of the wealth produced by other labor than that of agriculture, the monopolizers of all the land, though they have also monopolized legislation, have not been able to save themselves and their servants, the farmers, from becoming the most dependent class of men in the community. Thomas Hodgkin, Popular Political Economy, London, 1827, page 147, note. All methods in agriculture which on the one hand distribute expenditure on wages and means of labor more evenly over the whole year, and on the other hand shorten the turnover, by diversifying the products and thus making different crops possible during the year, require an increase in the circulating capital laid out on production, on wages, fertilizer, seed, etc. This is the case with the transition from the three-field system, with fallow, to the system of crop rotation without fallow. Also with the culture's derobes, undersowing system, in Flanders. The root crops are planted by undersowing. The same field first bears corn, flax or rapeseed for human requirements, and then after the harvest root crops are sown for the maintenance of cattle. This production time 321 system, which enables the horned cattle to remain permanently in the stall, produces a considerable amount of manure and is thus the cornerstone of crop rotation. More than a third of the cultivated area in the sandy districts is undersown in this way, just as if the cultivated land had been extended by a third. Besides root crops, clover and other fodder is also used here. Agriculture, being thus carried to the point at which it is transformed into horticulture, understandably requires a relatively considerable capital investment. In England, the sum reckoned with is 250 francs of investment capital to the hectare. In Flanders, our farmers will probably find an investment capital of 500 francs per hectare far too low. Essays sur l'économie rurale de la Belgique, par Émile de Lavallee, Brussels, 1863, pp. 59, 60, 63. Let us finally consider timber raising. The production of timber is fundamentally different from most others in that here natural forces work independently, and the power of men or capital is not required for natural growth. Even where forests are artificially cultivated, the amount of human and capital power expended in comparison with the action of natural forces is only slight. Furthermore, forests will thrive in types of soil and places where grain cannot grow, or where it no longer pays to produce it. Forest culture, however, requires a greater surface area than the cultivation of grain, if it is to be conducted on a regular commercial basis. Since small plots do not allow proper forestry methods, the secondary uses are abandoned, and forest protection is made more difficult, etc. The production process is also tied to such a long period of time that it extends beyond the plans of a private undertaking, and sometimes even beyond a single human life. Capital invested in the acquisition of forest land, in communal production this capital disappears and the question is simply how much land the community can withdraw from arable and grazing land for timber production. Only bears fruit after a comparatively long period of time, and turns over only partially, taking up to 150 years in the case of many types of wood. Moreover, effective timber production actually requires a reserve stock of growing timber amounting to between 10 and 40 times the annual yield. Thus, someone who does not have other income or possess substantial areas of forest cannot pursue regular forestry. Kirchhoff, page 58. The long production time, which includes a relatively slight amount, approximately 4 pounds and 8 pounds per acre respectively at the currency values of the time. 322 The turnover of capital of working time, and the consequent length of the turnover period, makes forest culture a line of business unsuited to private and hence to capitalist production, the latter being fundamentally a private operation, even when the associated capitalist takes the place of the individual. The development of civilization and industry in general has always shown itself so active in the destruction of forests that everything that has been done for their conservation and production is completely insignificant in comparison. Particularly worthy of note in the quotation from Kirchhoff is the following passage. Moreover, effective timber production actually requires a reserve stock of timber amounting to between 10 and 40 times the annual yield. Thus, the turnover takes from 10 years up to 40 and more. It is the same with cattle raising. Part of the herd, cattle stock, remains in the production process, while another part is sold as the annual product. Here only one part of the capital turns over each year, just as in the case of the fixed capital, machinery, draft cattle, etc. Even though this capital is fixed for a longer time in the production process, and thus lengthens the turnover of the total capital, it does not constitute fixed capital in the categorical sense. What is referred to here as a stock, a definite quantity of growing wood or cattle, exists partially in the production process, both as means of labor and material of labor. Depending on the natural conditions of its reproduction, a significant part must always exist in this form in the case of regular cultivation. A further kind of stock has a similar effect on the turnover, a stock that forms only potential productive capital, but has to be accumulated in larger or smaller amounts as a result of the nature of agriculture, and must be advanced to production for a relatively long time even though it enters the active production process only bit by bit. This includes manure, for example, before it is carted to the field, as well as corn, hay, etc. and any stocks of feed that go into the production of cattle. A considerable part of the working capital is contained in the stocks of the business. These can lose their value to a greater or lesser extent if the appropriate measures of protection required for their maintenance in good order are not taken. A part of the production stock can even be completely lost to the business by lack of attention. What is principally required in this connection is painstaking attention to the barns, fodder and grain lofts and cellars. The storage places must. Production time 323 always be kept well closed, and also kept clean, ventilated, etc. The grain and other crops kept in store must be thoroughly turned over from time to time, and potatoes and beets protected against frost, water and rot. Kirchhoff, page 292. In calculating one's own requirements, particularly for cattle, in which connection a division must be made according to the measure of the product in the intended use, attention must be paid not only to covering requirements, but also to having a sufficient stock left over for unforeseen contingencies. As soon as it appears that the need cannot be fully met by one's own production, it is necessary to take into consideration whether this lack cannot be covered by other products, substitutes, or whether these cannot be procured more cheaply in place of the missing products. If there should be a lack of hay, for example, this can be made up by root crops with added straw. In general, the material value and market price of the different products must be constantly borne in mind, and consumption regulated accordingly. If oats are dearer, for instance, while peas and rye are relatively cheap, then it will be advantageous to replace some of the oats for the horses with peas and rye, and sell the superfluous oats. Ibid. Page 300. In considering the formation of stock. We have already noted that a greater or lesser quantity of potential productive capital is required, i.e. a quantity of means of production destined for production, which has to be held in reserve in a greater or lesser amount in order to go into the production process bit by bit. We noted in this connection that with a capital investment of a given scale, the size of this production stock depends on the greater or lesser difficulty of its replacement, its relative proximity to the supplying markets, the development of means of transport and communication, etc. All these circumstances affect the minimum capital that must exist in the form of productive stock, and thus the period of time for which advances of capital have to be made, and the volume of capital that has to be advanced at once. This volume, which also has an effect on the turnover, is determined by the longer or shorter time for which circulating capital is tied up in the form of productive stock, as only potentially productive capital. On the other hand, insofar as the extent of this stagnation depends on the greater or lesser possibility of rapid replacement, on market conditions, etc., it itself arises from the circulation time, from circumstances that pertain to the circulation sphere. Moreover, a stock of all these implements or accessories, working. See above, pp. 215-20. 324. The turnover of capital tools, sieves, baskets, ropes, axle grease, nails, etc. is all the more necessary for replacement at any moment, the less opportunity there is of procuring them quickly in the vicinity. Finally, the entire inventory should be carefully inspected each winter, and the necessary additions and repairs immediately put in hand. Whether a larger or smaller stock of implements is generally needed is principally determined by local conditions. Where there are no craftsmen or shops in the vicinity, a greater stock must be kept than where these are to be found in the locality or very close by. If the requisite stocks are procured in greater quantities at once, under otherwise similar conditions, the advantage in cheap purchase is generally obtained, provided that a suitable point of time has been chosen. But of course a greater sum is then withdrawn at once from the current capital, which cannot always be dispensed with in the business. Kirchhoff, page 301. The difference between production time and working time, as we have seen, permits a wide range of possibilities. The circulating capita can be in its production time before it enters the actual labor process, manufacture of lasts. It may still be in production time after it has undergone the actual labor process, wine, seed corn. The production time may be occasionally interrupted by labor time, field crops, timber, or a large part of the product in a condition ready for circulation may remain incorporated in the active production process, while a much smaller part enters into the annual circulation, timber and cattle growing, the greater or lesser length of time. Thus the greater or lesser measure in which circulating capital has to be laid out all at once in the form of potential productive capital, partly arises from the kind of production process, agriculture, and partly depends on the proximity of markets, etc., in short, on circumstances that belong to the circulation sphere. We shall see later on, in Volume 3, what nonsensical theories McCulloch, James Mill, etc. were led to in their attempts to identify this production time diverging from working time with working time, attempts which in their turn arose from an incorrect application of the theory of value. Asterisk. On McCulloch see above, page 94. James Mill, the utilitarian philosopher, was in economics a disciple of Ricardo, his main economic work Elements of Political Economy being published in 1821. It is not in Volume 3 of Capital, as published, but rather in Theories of Surplus Value, that Marx's discussion of the elder Mill's futile attempts to resolve the contradictions of the Ricardian system is to be. Production time 325. The turnover cycle that we considered previously is a function of the durability of the fixed capital advanced to the production process. Since this encompasses a greater or smaller number of years, it also encompasses a series of turnovers of the fixed capital, repeated either yearly or within a year. In agriculture, a turnover cycle of this kind arises from the system of crop rotation. The duration of the lease must in any case not be shorter than the time taken to complete the system of crop rotation that is introduced, and hence with the three-field system it is always reckoned in terms of 3, 6, 9, etc. If we assume the three-field system with complete fallow, the field is cultivated only 4 times in 6 years, and in the years cultivated, with both winter and summer grain. The properties of the soil also require or permit this to be alternated between wheat and rye, barley and oats. Each kind of grain grows on the same soil better or worse than the others, each has a different value and is also sold at a different price. The yield of the land thus varies with the years of cultivation. It is different in the first half of the cycle, in the first 3 years, and in the second. Even the average yield over the whole cycle is not the same in one case as in the other, since fertility does not just depend on the quality of the soil, but also on the year's weather, the price also depending on many different conditions. If the yield is calculated on the basis of the average years of the entire cycle of 6 years, and of the average prices in these years, then the total yield for 1 year can be arrived at for either period of the rotation. But this is not the case if the yield is only calculated for half of the rotation, i.e. for 3 years, since then the total yields would not be the same. It is evident from this that the duration of the lease in the 3-field system must be fixed at least 6 years. It is always far more desirable for both landlord and tenant that the lease should run for a multiple of the lease, SIC, FE, and thus instead of 6 years in the case of the 3-field system, it should be 12 or 18 years or more, and in the case of the 7-field system not 7 but 14 or 28, Kirchhoff, pp. 117,118. The manuscript states here, the English system of crop rotation. A note on this to be given. FE, found, Part 1 II, pp. 84 ff. A discussion of McCool 10 chains coming later on in the same chapter, the disintegration of the Ricardian school, pp. 168 ff. Chapter 14. Circulation time. All the circumstances so far considered as differentiating the circulation periods of different capitals invested in different branches of industry, and hence also the times for which capital has to be advanced, such as the distinction between fixed and fluid capital, the difference in working periods, etc., arise within the production process itself. But the turnover time of capital is the sum of its production time and its circulation or rotation time. It is self-evident, therefore, that circulation times of varying length make for different times of turnover and thus different turnover periods. This becomes most readily apparent either when we compare two different capital investments in which all other circumstances modifying the turnover are equal and only the times of circulation are different, or when a given capital is taken with a given composition in terms of fixed and fluid capital, a given working period, etc., and only the circulation time is hypothetically varied. One section of circulation time, and relatively the most decisive one, consists of selling time, the period in which the capital exists in the state of commodity capital. According to the relative extent of this interval, the circulation time in general, and hence also the turnover period, is lengthened or shortened. An additional outlay of capital may also be necessary for costs of storage, etc. It is clear from the start that the time required for the sale of the finished product may be very different for individual capitalists in one and the same line of business, i.e. not only for the quantities of capital that are invested in different branches of production, but also for the various independent capitals invested in a particular sphere of production, which in actual fact simply constitute bits of the total capital which have attained an independent position. With other circumstances remaining the same, the selling period required by the same individual capital changes with the general fluctuations in market conditions, or with fluctuations in the particular line of business in question. We shall not deal any further. Circulation time 327 here with this point. We need only establish the simple fact that all circumstances that generally produce a variation in the turnover periods of capital invested in different lines of business may operate individually, e.g. if one capitalist has the occasion to sell more quickly than his competitor, if one applies more methods that shorten the working period than the other does, etc., and effect a similar variation in the turnover of the various capitals inhabiting the same line of business. A permanently effective cause of differentiation in the selling time, and hence in the turnover time in general, is the distance of the market where the commodities are sold from their place of production. For the whole period of its journey to the market, capital is confined to the state of commodity capital. If it is produced to order, then there is added to the time of the journey to the market the time in which the commodity is up for sale on the market. Improvement in the means of communication and transport shortens absolutely the period in which commodities migrate in this way, but it does not abolish the relative difference in the circulation time of different commodity capitals arising from the migration, or even that of different bits of the same commodity capital that migrate to different markets. Improved sailing ships and steamships, for instance, which shorten the journey, shorten it just as much for nearby ports as for distant ones. The relative difference remains, even though it is often reduced. The relative differences may however be displaced by the development of the means of communication and transport in a way that does not correspond to the natural distances. For instance, a railway leading from the place of production to a major inland center of population may lengthen the distance to a nearer inland point which is not served by a railway, absolutely or relatively, in comparison to the one naturally more distant. Similarly, the relative distances of places of production from the major market outlets may be altered as a result of the same circumstances, which explains the demise of old centers of production and the emergence of new ones with changes in the means of transport and communication. In addition to this, there is the relatively cheaper cost of transport for longer distances as compared to shorter. With the development of the means of transport, the speed of movement in space is accelerated, and spatial distance is thus shortened in time. In addition to this, the massive means of communication develops, so that for instance many ships depart for the same port at the same time, several trains run between the same 2 points along different railways, and, above all, freight ships leave Liverpool for New York, for example, on different 6A. 328 the turnover of capital sieve days of the week, and goods trains run at different hours of the day from Manchester to London. Admittedly, the last mentioned development does not alter the absolute speed, and so neither this part of the circulation time, if the effectiveness of the means of transport remains at a given level. But successive quantities of goods can now start their journey at more closely spaced intervals, and thus arrive on the market one after the other without accumulating in great masses as potential commodity capital until they are actually dispatched. Hence the reflux is distributed over shorter successive periods of time, so that one part is steadily being transformed into money capital while another part circulates as commodity capital. By this distribution of the reflux over several successive periods, the total circulation time is shortened, and hence also the turnover. At first, the greater or lesser frequency with which the means of transport function, e.g. the number of trains on a railway, develops with the degree to which a place of production produces more, and becomes a major center of production, and this is a development in the direction of the already existing market, i.e. towards the major centers of production and population, towards export ports, etc. On the other hand, however, and conversely, this particular ease of commerce and the consequent acceleration in the turnover of capital, inasmuch as this is determined by the circulation time, gives rise to an accelerated concentration of both the center of production and its market. With this accelerated concentration of people and capital at given points, the concentration of these masses of capital in a few hands makes rapid progress. There is simultaneously a further shift and displacement as a result of the change in the relative situation of production and marketplaces, which itself results from the changes in the means of communication. A place of production which possessed a particularly advantageous position through being situated on a main road or canal now finds itself on a single railway branch line that operates only at relatively long intervals, while another point, which previously lay completely off the major traffic routes, now lies at the intersection of several lines. The second place rises, the first declines. The changes in the means of transport therefore bring about local variations in the circulation time of commodities, in the opportunities to buy and sell, etc., or else they alter the distribution of already existing local variations. The importance of this factor in the turnover of capital is evinced by the disputes between the mercantile and industrial representatives of different places and the directors of railways. See for example the above quoted Blue Book of the Railway Committee. Circulation time 329. All branches of production which, owing to the nature of their product, are oriented principally to local outlets, such as breweries, thus develop to their largest dimensions in the major centers of population. Here the rapid turnover of capital partly balances out the increase in the cost of many conditions of production, building land, etc. If the progress of capitalist production and the consequent development of the means of transport and communication shortens the circulation time for a given quantity of commodities, the same progress and the opportunity provided by the development of the means of transport and communication conversely introduces the necessity of working for ever more distant markets, in a word, for the world market. The mass of commodities in transit grows enormously, and hence so does the part of the social capital that stays for long periods in the stage of commodity capital, in circulation time. Both absolutely and relatively. A simultaneous and associated growth occurs in the portion of social wealth that, instead of serving as direct means of production, is laid out on means of transport and communication, and on the fixed and circulating capital required to keep these in operation. Merely the relative length of the journey of commodities from their place of production to their outlet gives rise to a difference not only in the first part of the circulation time, the selling time, but also in the second part, the transformation of money back into the elements of productive capital, the purchasing time. Say that the commodity is sent to India. This takes maybe 4 months. Let us take the selling time as 0, i.e. assume that the commodity is shipped to order and paid for on delivery to the producer's agent. A further 4 months is required to send back the money. The form in which it is remitted is immaterial here. It is thus altogether 8 months before the same capital can function once again as productive capital, and can be used to renew the same operation. The variations in turnover brought about in this way form one of the material bases for differing periods of credit, just as overseas trade in general, in Venice and Genoa, for instance, formed one of the original sources of the credit system in its true sense. The crisis of 1847 enabled the banking and mercantile community of that time to reduce the India and China usance time allowed for the currency of bills of exchange between there and Europe, from 10 months date to 6 months sight, and the lapse of 20 years with all the accelerations of speed and establishment of telegraphs. Renders necessary a further reduction, from 6 months sight to 4 months date as a first step to 4 months sight. The voyage of 330. The turnover of capital a sailing vessel via the Cape from Calcutta to London is on the average under 90 days. An usance of 4 months sight would be equal to a currency of say 150 days. The present usance of 6 months sight is equal to a currency of say 210 days. Economist, the 16th of June 1866. On the other hand, the Brazilian usance remains at 2 and 3 months sight. Bills from Antwerp are drawn, on London, at 3 months date, and even Manchester and Bradford draw upon London at 3 months and longer dates. By tacit consent, a fair opportunity is afforded to the merchant of realizing the proceeds of his merchandise, not indeed before, but within a reasonable time of, when, the bills drawn against it fall due. In this view, the present usance for Indian bills cannot be considered excessive. Indian produce for the most part being sold in London with 3 months prompt, and allowing for loss of time in effecting sales, cannot be realized much within 5 months, while another period of 5 months will have previously elapsed, on average, between the time of purchase in India and of delivery in the English warehouse. We have here a period of 10 months, whereas the bill drawn against the goods does not live beyond 7 months, Ibid. The 30th of June 1866. On the 2nd of July 1866, 5 big London banks dealing mainly with India and China, and the Paris Comptoir d'Escompte, gave notice that, from the 1st of January 1867, their branches and agencies in the East will only buy and sell bills of exchange at a term not exceeding 4 months. Cite, Ibid. The 7th of July 1866. However, this reduction miscarried, and had to be abandoned. Since then, the Suez Canal has revolutionized all this. It is clear that with the longer circulation time of commodities, the risk of a change of price on the selling market rises, owing to the lengthening of the period in which this price change can occur. A difference in circulation time, both individually between different capitals in the same branch of industry, and between different branches of industry according to the different usances, when payment is not immediately made in cash, arises from the different terms of payment in purchase and sale. We shall not dwell any longer on this point here, although it is important for the credit system. The size of delivery contracts, which grows with the volume and scale of capitalist production, also gives rise to differences in the turnover time. The contract of delivery, as a transaction between buyer and seller, is an operation pertaining to the market, to the sphere of circulation. The differences in turnover time arising from it thus arise from the circula. Circulation time 331 tion sphere, but they react directly back on the production sphere, quite apart from all terms of payment and credit conditions, even with cash payment. Coal, cotton, yam, etc. are discrete products. Each day provides its quantity of finished product. But if the spinner or mine owner agrees to deliver quantities of products which require, say, a 4-week or 6-week period of successive working days, it is just the same, with respect to the length of time for which capital has to be advanced, as if a continuous working period of 4 to 6 weeks was introduced into his labor process. It is of course assumed here that the entire quantity of products ordered is to be delivered at once, or at least is paid for only after it has all been delivered. E3.ch day, then, considered in isolation, has provided its particular quantity of finished products. But this finished quantity is still only a part of the quantity contracted for. If the already finished part of the commodities ordered is no longer in the production process, it is still merely lying in the warehouse as potential capital. We come now to the second stage of the circulation time, the time of purchase, or the period in which the capital is transformed back from the money form into the elements of productive capital. In the course of this period it must persist for a shorter or longer time in its state of money capital, and thus a certain part of the total capital advanced always exists in the state of money capital, although this part consists of constantly changing elements. In a particular business, for instance, NX 100 pounds of the total capital advanced has to be present in the form of money capital. This is continuously being transformed into productive capital, but just as constantly being added to again by the influx from circulation, from the realized commodity capital. Thus a definite portion of the capital value advanced always exists in the state of money capital, in a form pertaining not to its sphere of production but rather to its sphere of circulation. We have already seen how, when the time in which capital is confined to the form of commodity capital is prolonged, by the greater distance of the market, this directly gives rise to a delayed reflux of money, and thus also delays the transformation of capital from money capital into productive capital. We also saw, Chapter 6, with respect to the purchase of commodities, how the time of purchase, and the greater or lesser distance from the major sources of raw material, makes it necessary to buy raw materials for longer periods and keep them available in the form of productive stock, latent or potential productive capital. How this in 332 the turnover of capital creases the mass of capital that must be advanced at one stroke, and the time for which it must be advanced, the scale of production being otherwise the same. In different branches of industry, the shorter or longer periods for which large quantities of raw materials are thrown onto the market have a similar effect. In London, for instance, major auctions of wool take place every 3 months, and these dominate the wool market, whereas the cotton market is on the whole supplied continuously from harvest to harvest, even if not always evenly. Periods of this kind determine the major terms of purchase for these raw materials, and particularly affect speculative purchases, making necessary longer or shorter advances in these elements of production, just as the nature of the commodities produced affects the speculative and deliberate withholding of products from the market for longer or shorter periods in the form of potential commodity capital. The agriculturalist must therefore also be a speculator to a certain extent, and hold back the sale of his products according to the conditions of the time. Single quote. A few general rules follow. F.E. Marketing the products, however, mostly depends on the person, the product itself and the locality. Someone who, besides being skillful and fortunate, is endowed with sufficient operating capital, is not to be blamed if he sometimes lets the crops he has obtained lie for a year when prices are unusually low. Someone who has insufficient operating capital, on the other hand, or who completely lacks the spirit of speculation, will seek to obtain the current average price, and will thus have to sell as soon and as often as he has the opportunity. To let wool lie for longer than a year will almost always involve a loss, while corn and oilseed can be kept for a few years without any detriment to their quality and properties. Products that are generally subject to a substantial rise and fall in price over short periods of time, such as for example oilseed, hops, teasels and the like, are rightly left to lie in the years when their prices stand far below the prices of production. One should least delay the sale of such objects as give rise to daily costs of maintenance, such as fattened cattle, or are liable to spoil, such as fruit, potatoes, etc. In many districts, a product generally has at certain times of the year its lowest price, at other times its highest. Grain, for instance, is in many places generally lower in price at Martinmas than between Christmas and Easter. There are also many products in several districts that are only good for sale at certain times, as is the case with circulation time 333 wool in the wool markets of those districts where at other times the wool trade is generally dull, etc. Kirchhoff, page 302. In considering the second half of the circulation time, during which money is transformed back into the elements of productive capital, it is not only this conversion alone that is involved, nor only the time in which the money flows back, according to the distance of the market where the product is sold. What is also and especially involved is the extent to which a part of the capital advanced must always exist in the money form, in the state of money capital. If we leave out of consideration all speculative activities, the scale of purchases of those commodities that must be constantly present as a productive stock depends on the latter's periods of renewal, on circumstances that in turn depend on market conditions, and hence vary for different raw materials, etc. Here, therefore, money must from time to time be advanced in large amounts at once. But whether it flows back quicker or more slowly, according to the turnover of the capital, it always flows back bit by bit. One part of it is just as regularly spent again at short intervals, the part transformed back into wages. Another part, however, that transformed back into raw materials, etc., has to be accumulated for a longer period of time as a reserve fund, either for purchase or for payment. It therefore exists in the form of money capital, although the extent to which it exists in this form changes. We shall see in the next chapter how other circumstances, arising both from the production and the circulation processes, require this presence of a definite portion of the capital advanced in the money form. It should generally be noted, however, that the economists are much inclined to forget not only that a part of the capital needed in a business is constantly passing alternately through the three forms of money capital, productive capital and commodity capital, but that it is always different portions of this that possess these forms alongside each other, even if the relative magnitudes of these portions are in constant flux. It is particularly the part always present as money capital that the economists forget, although precisely this circumstance is very necessary for the understanding of the bourgeois economy, and makes itself felt as such in practice as well. Chapter 15. Effect of circulation time on the magnitude of the capital advanced. In this chapter and the one following, we deal with the influence of circulation time on the valorization of capital. First example. Let us consider a commodity capital that is the product of a working period of 9 weeks, for example. We abstract for the time being both from the portion of the product's value that is added to it by the average wear and tear of the fixed capital, and from the surplus value added to it during the production process, so that the value of this product can be taken as equal to the value of the fluid capital advanced for its production, i.e. the value of the wages and of the raw and ancillary materials consumed in its production. Let this value be £900, so that the weekly outlay amounts to £100. The periodic production time, which coincides here with the working period, is 9 weeks. It is immaterial in this connection whether we assume a working period for a continuous product or a continuous working period for a discrete product, as long as the quantum of the discrete product that is put on the market at one stroke simply takes 9 weeks' labor. Let the circulation time be 3 weeks. The total turnover period is then 12 weeks. After 9 weeks have elapsed, the productive capital advanced is transformed into commodity capital, but it now has to spend 3 weeks in the circulation period. Thus, the new cycle of production can begin again only at the start of the 13th week, and production is at a standstill for 3 weeks, or a quarter of the total circulation period. It is also immaterial whether we suppose that this is the average time that it takes to sell the commodity, or whether the time is determined by the distance of the market, or alternatively again, by the date of payment for the commodity sold. In every 3 months, production is at a halt for 3 weeks, i.e. for 4 times 3 equals 12 weeks equals 3 months of the year, or a quarter of the annual turnover period. Hence, if production is to be continuous, pursued on the same scale week in, week out, there are only 2 possibilities. Effect of circulation time on the magnitude of capital advanced 335. One possibility is that the scale of production is cut back, so that the sum of £900 is now sufficient to keep work going during the circulation time of the first turnover as well as during the working period. A second working period is then begun in the 10th week, and thus a new turnover period as well. Before the first turnover period is at an end, since the turnover period is a 12-week one, while the working period is 9 weeks. £900 divided by 12 weeks gives £75 per week. It is clear straight away that a cut of this kind in the scale of business presupposes different dimensions for the fixed capital, and thus a reduced investment in general. It is questionable, however, whether this reduction can always be made, since the development of production in the various branches of industry sets a normal minimum of capital investment below which the business in question will cease to be competitive. This normal minimum itself grows steadily with the development of capital east production, and so it is in no way fixed. Between the normal minimum at any time and the normal maximum, which is itself continuously on the increase, there are several intermediate levels. A middle range that permits varying degrees of capital investment. Within the bounds of this middle range, therefore, there can be a reduction in scale, the limits to this being fixed by the normal minimum at the time. In the case of a hold-up of production, oversupply of markets, increase in prices of raw materials, etc., the limitation of the normal outlay of circulation capital in relation to a given basis of fixed capital takes the form of a limitation of working hours, for example only half the day being worked, just as in periods of prosperity there is an abnormal extension of the circulating capital on the given basis of fixed capital. Partly by the prolongation of working hours, partly by their intensification. With businesses that have always to reckon with fluctuations of this kind, these are coped with partly by the above means, and partly also by the employment of a larger number of workers, combined with a reserve of fixed capital, e.g. reserve locomotives on the railways, etc. Here we leave such abnormal fluctuations out of account, as we are assuming normal conditions. For production to be continuous, the same circulating capital must be distributed in this case over a longer period of time, over 12 weeks instead of 9. In any given interval of time, therefore, the productive capital function is reduced. The fluid part of the productive capital is reduced from 100 to 75, i.e. by a quarter. The total sum by which the productive capital functioning during the 9-week working period is reduced is 9 times 25 equals 225 pounds, or a quarter of the 900 pounds. But the ratio 336, the turnover of capital of the circulation time to the turnover period, is also 1. 32 equals 1. It follows therefore that if production is not to be interrupted during the circulation time of the productive capital that has been transformed into commodity capital, if it is rather to be continued simultaneously and continuously week by week, and there is no special circulating capital available for this purpose, the goal can only be attained by reducing the scale of the productive operations, by diminishing the fluid component of the functioning productive capital. The portion of fluid capital thus set free for production during the circulation time is related to the total fluid capital advanced as the circulation time is to the turnover period. The already noted, this applies only to branches of production in which the labor process is continued week in, week out on the same scale, and where the amounts of capital that have to be laid out do not vary between the different working periods, as in agriculture. If, however, we assume the reverse of this, namely that the nature of the investment excludes a reduction in the scale of production and hence also in the fluid capital to be advanced each week, then the continuity of production can be maintained only by an additional fluid capital, in the above case one of 300 pounds. During the turnover period of 12 weeks, 1,200 pounds is successively advanced, of which 300 pounds makes a quarter, as does 3 weeks out of 12. After the working period of 9 weeks, the capital value of 900 pounds is transformed from the form of productive capital into that of commodity capital. Its working period is concluded, and this cannot immediately be repeated with the same capital. During the 3 weeks for which the capital exists in the circulation sphere, functioning as commodity capital, it is the same for the production process as if it did not exist at all. We are abstracting here from all credit relations, and assume therefore that the capitalist operates only with his own capital. But while the capital advanced for the first working period spends 3 weeks in the circulation process after completing its production process, an additional capital outlay of 300 pounds now functions, so that the continuity of production is not interrupted. The following must now be noted in this connection. Firstly, the working period of the capital of 900 pounds originally advanced is ended after 9 weeks, and yet the capital does not return for another 3 weeks, until the beginning of the 13th week. A new working period, however, is immediately opened with the additional capital of 300 pounds. This is precisely how the continuity of production is maintained. Secondly, the functions of the original capital of 900 pounds, and of the capital of 300 pounds newly advanced at the close of the first 9-week work. Effective circulation time on the magnitude of capital advanced 331 ing period, which opens the second working period without interruption on the close of the first, are completely separate in the first turnover period, or can at least be separated, whereas in the course of the second turnover period they cut across one another. We can represent the matter more clearly in the following way. First turnover period of 12 weeks. First 9-week working period. The turnover of the capital advanced in this period is completed by the start of the 13th week. During the last 3 weeks the additional capital of 300 pounds functions, opening the second 9-week working period. Second turnover period. At the start of the 13th week, 900 pounds has returned and is available to begin a new turnover. But the second working period has already opened in the 10th week with the additional 300 pounds. By the beginning of the 13th week, a third of this working period has been completed by means of this capital, and 300 pounds has been transformed from productive capital into products. Since there are only 6 weeks more to go till the end of the second working period, only 2/3 of the returned capital of 900 pounds, i.e. only 600 pounds, can enter the production process of the second working period. 300 pounds of the original 900 pounds is set free, to play the same role that the capital of 300 pounds played in the first working period. At the end of the 6th week of the second turnover period, the second working period is concluded. The capital of 900 pounds laid out on it flows back 3 weeks later, at the end of the 9th week of the second 12-week turnover period. During the 3 weeks of its circulation time the capital of 300 pounds that was set free enters the scene. This begins the third working period of a capital of 900 pounds in the 7th week of the second turnover period, or the 19th week of the year. Third turnover period. The end of the 9th week of the second turnover period brought a new reflux of 900 pounds. But the third working period had already begun in the 7th week of this turnover period, and 6 weeks of this have already elapsed, by the start of the third turnover. Thus it has only 3 more weeks to run. Of the 900 pounds that returned, only 300 pounds therefore goes into the production process. The fourth working period comprises the remaining 9 weeks of this turnover period, and thus the fourth turnover period and the fifth working period begin together with the 37th week of the year. Second example. In order to simplify the example for purposes of calculation, we shall assume a working period of 5 weeks and a circulation time of 5 weeks, making a turnover period of 10 weeks, 338 the turnover of capital 50 weeks to the year, and a capital outlay of 100 pounds per week. Thus the working period requires a fluid capita of 500 pounds, and the circulation time of the additional capital of further 500 pounds. Working periods and turnover times can now be represented as follows. Working period. Weeks. Commodities in pound. Returning 1. 1 to 5. 500. End of week 10 2. 6 to 10. 500. N. 15 3. 11 to 15. Su. 24. 16 to 20. 500. 25 5. 21 to 25. Su. 30 etc. If the circulation time was 0, so that the turnover period was the same as the working period, the number of turnovers would simply equal the number of working periods in the year, hence with a 5-week working period, 50. 5 equals 10. The value of the capital turned over would be 500 times 10 equals 5,000 pounds. In the above table, where a circulation time of 5 weeks is assumed, a value of 5,000 pounds in commodities is still produced each year, but 1/10 of this, la. 500 pounds, is always in the shape of commodity capital, and returns only after 5 weeks delay. At the end of the year, therefore, the product of the 10th working period, weeks 46 to 50, has only completed half its turnover time, since its circulation time falls into the first 5 weeks of the ensuing year. Third example. We now take a third example. Working period 6 weeks, circulation time 3 weeks, weekly advance for the labor process 100 pounds. First working period. Weeks 1 to 6. At the end of the 6th week a commodity capital of 600 pounds, returning at the end of week 9. Second working period. Weeks 7 to 12. 300 pounds additional capital advanced during weeks 7 to 9. A return of 600 pounds at the end of week 9. 300 pounds of this advanced in weeks 10 to 12, so that 300 pounds is free at the end of week 12, and 600 pounds present in commodity capital, returning at the end of week 15. Third working period. Weeks 13 to 18. Advance of the above 300 pounds in weeks 13 to 15, then return of 600 pounds, of which 300 pounds is advanced for weeks 16 to 18. At the end of week 18, 300 pounds is free in money, 600 pounds is present in commodity capital, and returns at the end of week 21. For a more detailed presentation of this case see heading 2 below. 600 times 9 equals 5,400 pounds worth of commodities are thus produced in 9 working periods, equals 54 weeks. At the end of the 9th working period. Effective circulation time on the magnitude of capital advanced 339. The capitalist has 300 pounds in money, and 600 pounds in commodities which have not yet completed their circulation time. When we compare these 3 examples, we find, firstly, that only in the second example do capital I of 500 pounds and additional capital II, also 500 pounds, successively replace one another, so that the 2 portions of capital perform their movements separately, and this is simply because the assumption is made that the case is the highly exceptional one in which the working period and the circulation time form 2 equal halves of the turnover period. In all other cases, no matter what the discrepancy between the 2 sections of the turnover period may be, the movements of the 2 capitals intersect, as in the first and third examples, right from the second turnover period onwards. The capital functioning in the second turnover period is then formed by the additional capital I together with a part of capital I, while the remainder of capital I is set free for the original function of capital II. The capital active during the circulation time of the commodity capital is no longer identical with the capital I originally advanced for this purpose, but it is equal to it in value and forms the same aliquot part of the total capital advanced. Secondly, the capital which has functioned during the working period lies idle during the circulation time. In the second example, the capital functions for a working period of 5 weeks and is idle for a circulation period of 5 weeks. Thus, the overall time during which capital I is idle amounts to half of every year. However, the additional capital required to maintain the continuity of production during the circulation time is not determined by the total sum of circulation time within any year, but simply by the ratio of circulation time to turnover period. We assume here of course that all the turnovers take place under the same conditions. Hence it is an additional capital of 500 pounds that is needed in the second example, and not one of 2,500 pounds. This simply follows from the fact that the additional capital enters the turnover just as much as that originally advanced, and so is replaced after a number of turnovers just as the former was. Thirdly, it in no way alters the circumstances considered here if the production time is longer than the working time. The total turnover period is certainly extended by this factor, but this extended turnover does not require any additional capital for the labor process. The additional capital simply has the job of filling up the gaps in the labor process that are due to the circulation time, and so it has to protect production only from disturbances that arise as a result of this circular 340 the turnover of capital T on time. disturbances that arise from the specific conditions of production are taken care of in another way, which is not under consideration here. There are however businesses where work is done only spasmodically, to order, and in which there can be interruptions between the working periods for this reason. In such cases the need for additional capital is proportionately reduced. In most types of seasonal work, moreover, there is also a certain limit for the reflux. The same work cannot be repeated the next year with the same capital, if this capital has not meanwhile completed its circulation time. The circulation time may however be less than the interval between one production period and the next. In this case the capital lies idle unless it is applied in the meantime in another manner. Fourthly, the capital advanced for one working period, e.g. the £600 in the third example, is laid out partly on raw and ancil 1 airy materials, in a productive stock for the working period, in constant circulating capital, and partly in variable circulating capital, in payment for labor itself. Not all of that part of the capital laid out on constant circulating capital need exist for the same length of time in the form of productive stock, e.g. raw material may not be stored for the whole working period, or coal may be procured every 2 weeks. Nonetheless, if we again exclude credit here, this part of the capital, insofar as it is not present in the form of a productive stock, must still remain available in the money form, in order to be transformed into productive stock AC according to need. This in no way alters the value of the constant circulating capital advanced for 6 weeks. Wages, on the other hand, quite apart from the money for unforeseen expenses, the specific reserve fund to cope with disturbances, are paid at shorter intervals, mostly weekly. So except where the capitalist forces the worker to make particularly long advances of his labor, the capital needed for wages must be present in the money form. When capital returns, therefore, one part must be kept in the form of money for payment of labor, while another part can be transformed into productive stock. The additional capital is divided up just like the original capital. But what distinguishes it from capital I is that it must already be advanced for the entire duration of the first working period of capital I, which it is not involved in order to be available for its own working period. This is again abstracting from credit relations. During this time it can be at least partially transformed already into constant circulating capital. The extent to which it assumes this last form, or else persists in the form of additional money capital until the time that this effective circulation time on the magnitude of capital advance 341 formation is necessary, will depend partly on the particular production conditions of the specific lines of business involved, partly on local circumstances, and partly on fluctuations in the price of raw materials, etc. If we consider the total social capital, then a more or less significant part of this additional capital exists for a prolonged time in the state of money capital. As far as the part of capital 2 advanced for wages is concerned, however, it is only gradually transformed into labor power, inasmuch as the working periods that elapse and are paid for are relatively short. This part of capital II is thus present in the form of money capital for the whole duration of the working period, until it is transformed into labor power and thus embarks on the function of productive capital. This intervention of the additional capital required for the conversion of capital I's circulation time into production time thus not only increases the size of the capital advanced in the length of time for which the total capital has to be advanced, but it also specifically increases that part of the capital advanced that exists as a money reserve, exists in the state of money capital and possesses the form of potential money capital. The same thing occurs, as concerns both an advance of capital in the form of productive stock and that in the form of a money reserve, if the division of the capital into 2 parts that is required by the circulation time. Capital for the first working period and replacement capital for the circulation time is brought about not by an increase in the capital laid out, but instead by a reduction in the scale of production. In relation to the scale of production, the capital confined to the money form increases here still further. What is always attained by this division of the capital into original productive capital and additional capital is the uninterrupted succession of working periods, the steady functioning of an equal-sized part of the capital advanced as productive capital. Let us consider the second example. The capital existing in the production process at any one time is £500. Since the working period is 5 weeks, this capital operates 10 times in every 50 weeks, taken as a year. If we disregard surplus value, the product therefore amounts to LOX 500 equals £5,000. From the standpoint of the capital functioning directly and uninterruptedly in the production process, a capital value of £500. The circulation time thus appears to have disappeared completely. The turnover period coincides with the working period. The circulation time is assumed to be 0. 342 The turnover of capital. But if the capital of £500 were to be regularly inhibited in its productive activity by the circulation time of 5 weeks, so as to be only ready for production once again after completing the entire turnover period of 10 weeks, we should have, in the 50-week year, 5 10-week turnovers. These would include 5 5-week production periods, i.e. a total of 25 weeks production with a total product of 5 by 500 equals £2,500, and 5 5-week circulation times, i.e. a total circulation time of also 25 weeks. If we say in this case that the capital of £500 has turned over 5 times in the year, then it is perfectly clear that for half of each turnover period this capital of £500 has not functioned as productive capital at all, and that, all things considered, it has functioned only for half the year, and not during the other half. In our example, the replacement capital of £500 enters the scene for the duration of these 5 circulation times, and in this way the turnover is raised from £2,500 to £5,000. But the capital advanced is now £1,000 instead of £500. 5,000 divided by 1,000 is 5. Thus instead of 10 turnovers we have 5. But because it is then said that the capital of £1,000 has turned over 5 times in the year, the memory of the circulation time vanishes from the empty heads of the capitalists, and the confused idea is formed that this capital has functioned constantly in the production process throughout the 5 successive turnovers. However, when we say that the capital of £1,000 has turned over 5 times, we include in this the circulation time as well as the production time. In fact, if £1,000 really had been continuously active in the production process, then the product would have been £10,000, on the basis of our assumptions, instead of £5,000. And in order to have £1,000 continuously in the production process, a capital of £2,000 would have had to be advanced. The economists, who have never produced a clear AC count of the turnover mechanism, constantly overlook this basic aspect, i.e. the fact that only a part of the industrial capital can be actually engaged in the production process, if production is to proceed without interruption. In other words, one part can function as productive capital only on condition that another part is withdrawn from production proper in the form of commodity or money capital. Since this is overlooked, so also is the importance and role of money capital in general. What we now have to investigate is the difference in the turnover that arises according to whether the 2 sections of the turnover period, working period and circulation period, are equal, or whether the working period is longer or shorter than the circulation period. Further, how this affects the tying up of capital in the form of money capital. Effective circulation time on the magnitude of capital advanced 343. We assume here that the capital advanced each week is and encases £100, and the turnover period 9 weeks, so that the capital that has to be advanced for each turnover period is £900. Working period and circulation period equal this case, though in reality it is only a chance exception, must serve as the starting point for the discussion, since it is here that conditions are present in their simplest and most palpable form. The 2 capitals, capital I, which is advanced for the first working period, and additional capital II, which functions during the circulation period of capital I, relieve one another in their movements without crossing each other's path. With the exception of the first period, therefore, each of the 2 capitals is advanced only for its own turnover period. If the turnover period is 9 weeks, as in the following examples, then the working period and circulation period are accordingly both 4.5 weeks. We then have the following schema for a complete year. Table I. The 51 weeks that we take here as the year. Capital I has concluded 6 fun working periods, and thus produced commodities to the value of 6 times 450 equals £2,700. Capital II has produced commodities for 5 full working periods, 5 times 450 equals £2,250. Capital II has also produced a further £150 in the final 1.5 weeks of the year, midweek 50 to end of week 51, a total product of £5, 100 in 51 weeks. As far as the direct production of surplus value is concerned, and this is produced only during the working period itself, the total capital of £900 has turned over 5F times, 5F x 900 equals 5,100. But if we consider the real turnover, then capital I has turned over 5F times, since at the end of week 51 it has only 3 weeks of its 6th turnover period still to complete. 5F x 450 equals £2,550, while capital II has turned over 5 times, since it has only completed 1.5 weeks of its 6th turnover period, and a further 7.5 weeks of this fall in the coming year. 5I x 450 equals £2,325. Real amount turned over equals £4,875. We may treat capital I and capital II as 2 quite independent capitals. In their movements they are completely autonomous. These movements are complementary only insofar as their working and circulation periods directly relieve one another. They can be considered as 2 completely independent capitals, belonging to different capital ISDS.
I меньше чем. Запятой, двоеточие, двоеточие. Дефис, 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 точка. I, U, S.
C, J.
U, 5. 0. Точка с запятой, точка, двоеточие. 0.
J, J. C, J. C.
Точка. U. Точка.
I, U.
E.
0 inches, OOJ.
1, 1.
C, J, Q.
T, R, O. U.
T, O, V, I, V, I.
Восклицательный знак.
NMVII.
Точка. 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 Точка.
OOOOOOV. IV, V, IV, IV, EOVVVVVV. NO1 in T, VV.
Точка. 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 Точка.
If
точка, 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 T, точка, 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 двойной апостроф, 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 точка,
6 OB.
точка,
NMV OT, OV, IV, I9, Y. 1 inch 160 feet, OOT, 6. NM, T. Equals S.
точка, 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 дефис, точка, S,
I. U.
X, U, 5,
C. J.
точка, запятая,
JJ.
точка, дефис, 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 точка, запятая, запятая,
I. U.
дефис, 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 S, точка, восклицательный знак, двоеточие, S, U,
MN. NRT.
двоеточие, двоеточие,
C. J. C. OO. Vil. Lee.
точка, точка, T, I, J, I, точка,
NMVII. OOOOOOV. I. V. IV. IV. I. VV versus V.
UT, OV, IV 0,
N. T. V. I. J. NMV. Circa. C. T. R. O. U2.
точка, 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 точка,
VN1. I0G. 1 inch. INMV. O. C.
апостроф, двойной апостроф, точка, точка, апостроф, двойной апостроф, двоеточие, точка, апостроф, двойной апостроф, точка, 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 апостроф, двойной апостроф, двоеточие, 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 ай, 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 ай,
V. IMNO underscore NMVO.
двоеточие, 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 апостроф, дефис, закрывающая квадратная скобка, двоеточие, 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 двоеточие,
T. R. 0 inches.
точка,
CIJ equals. Greater than.
точка, точка,
GOC. Plus. L. A.
D08, 3,
Q. TF. Q.
точка,
Q. TS. O. U. C. O. A. TF.
1, 4,
C. 8.
А больше, чем Е,
TF.
и С, I, 0, больше, чем 1, 4, TF,
Q.
TF, С, I,
O. C equals. SA. Greater than.
точка, дефис, двоеточие, 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 А больше, чем C, точка, TF,
TF.
Q, А больше, чем S, O0, точка, точка,
TF. CD.
А больше, чем 9, 1, 4,
C. CQ.
D, SSA больше, чем
C. 1 to 4Q. C.
1, 4, нижнее подчеркивание, Q, TF больше, чем SO0, S, S0, 0,8 COTF, C равно TF,
C. G. 8 minus 5A. Greater than 1 to 4. C. Q. F4 CNTF. A. It. A. Greater than A. Greater than.
G, CF, апостроф, двойной апостроф, апостроф, двойной апостроф, апостроф, двойной апостроф, апостроф, двойной апостроф, точка, апостроф, двойной апостроф, двоеточие, апостроф, двойной апостроф, апостроф, двойной апостроф, точка, точка, апостроф, двойной апостроф, точка, точка, апостроф, двойной апостроф, точка, точка, апостроф, двойной апостроф, точка, апостроф, двойной апостроф, точка, дефис, О, 0, О, В, дефис,
M. O.
точка,
C. POC U3. Effective circulation time on the magnitude of capital advanced 345 capital I has gone through 5 complete turnover periods and 2/3 of its sixth. It exists at the end of the year in the form of commodity capital, requiring a further 3 weeks for its normal realization. It functions as commodity capital and circulates. As far as its last turnover goes, it has completed only 2/3 of it. This is expressed by saying that it has turned over only 2/3 of a time, only 2/3 of its total value has turned over completely. We say that £450 completes its turnover in 9 weeks, and therefore £300 does so in 6 weeks. By expressing it in this way, we leave aside the organic relations between the two specific and different components of the turnover time, since the exact sense of the statement that the capital of £450 advanced has made 51 turnovers is simply that it has made 5 turnovers and only completed 2/3 of its sixth. Nevertheless, the expression that the capital turned over is 5f the capital advanced, Thus in the above case 5fx 450 equals £2,550, as correct in the sense that, if this capital of £450 were not supplemented by another capital of £450, then one part of it would have to exist in the production process, and another part in the circulation process. If the turnover time is to be expressed in terms of the quantity of capital turned over, it can only ever be expressed in a quantity of existing value, in fact, of finished products. The circumstance that the capital advanced does not exist in a state in which it can reopen the production process once again is expressed in the form that only one part of it exists in a state suitable for production, or that, in order to exist in a state of continuous production, the capital must always be divided into one part that is in the production period and another part in the circulation period, according to the ratio between these two periods. This is the same law as that which determines the mass of productive capital functioning at one time by the ratio of circulation time to turnover time. Of capital 2, at the end of week 51, which we take here as the close of the year, £150 is advanced in the production of unfinished products. A further part exists in the fund of fluid constant capital, raw material, etc. In a form in which it can function as productive capital in the production process. But a third part exists in the money fund, a quantity at least as great as the mo1t of wages for the remainder of the working period, 3 weeks, which are paid only at the end of each week. Even though this part of the capital does not exist in the form of productive capital at the beginning of the new year, of a new turnover cycle, but rather in the form of money capital in which it is incapable of entering the production process, the new turnover never the 346 the turnover of capital less opens with fluid variable capital, i.e. living labor power, active in the production process. This phenomenon comes about because although labor power is bought and used at the beginning of the working period, say weekly, it is paid for only at the end of the week. Here money functions as means of payment. It therefore exists on the one hand as money still in the hands of the capitalist, while on the other hand labor power, the commodity into which it is converted, is already active in the production process, and thus the same capital value here appears twofold. If we consider simply the working periods, then capital I has produced 6 times 450 equals £2,700. 2. 5tx 450 equals £2,400 i.e. together 5fx 900 equals £5,100. The money capital of £900 advanced has thus functioned as productive capital 5f times in the year. As far as the production of surplus value is concerned, it is all the same whether £450 in the production process always functions alternately with £450 in the circulation process, or whether £900 functions for 4.5 weeks in the circulation process. If we consider the turnover periods, on the other hand, then capital I has turned over 5fx 450 equals £2,550. 2. 5tx 450 equals £2,325 i.e. the total capital turned over is 5.1. 5.2 times 900 equals £4,875 tills is because the turnover of the total capital is equal to the amounts of capitals I and 2 turned over, divided by the sum of capitals I and 2. It should be noted here that capitals I and 2, if they really were independent of one another, would still only form different independent parts of the social capital advanced in the same branch of production. If the social capital in this branch of production consisted only of I and 2, same calculation would hold for the turnover of the social capital in this branch as holds here for the two components I and 2 of the same private capital. Any portion of the total social capital in a particular branch of production can be calculated in this way by extension. Finally, the number of turnovers of the total social capital equals the sum of the capital turned over in the various branches of production, divided by the sum of the capital advanced in these branches. Effective circulation time on the magnitude of capital advanced 347. It should further be noted that, just as here, in the same private BU, INUS, the two capitals I and I have, in the strict sense, different turnover years, inasmuch as the turnover cycle of capital 2 begins 4.5 weeks later than that of capital I, and I's year therefore comes to a close 4.5 weeks earlier than that of 2. So too the various private capitals in the same branch of production begin business at quite different points in time and hence complete their annual turnover at different times of the year. The same average calculation that we applied above to I and 2 also serves here to reduce the turnover years of the various independent parts of the social capital to a uniform turnover year. 2. Working period longer than circulation period. In this case the working and turnover periods of capitals I and 2 cut across one another, instead of following on from each other. We also find capital set free, which was not the position in the case considered previously. This is in no way altered by the fact that now, as previously, 1. The number of working periods of the total capital advanced is equal to the value of the annual product of the two parts of the capital advanced, divided by the total capital advanced, and 2. The number of turnovers of the total capital is equal to the sum of the two amounts turned over, divided by the sum of the two capitals advanced. Here, too, we must consider the two portions of capital as if they performed their turnover movements in complete independence of one another. We assume once again that £100 has to be advanced each week in the labor process. The working period lasts for 6 weeks, and therefore requires an advance of £600, capital I. The circulation period is 3 weeks, and so the turnover period, as above, is 9 weeks. A capital 2 of £300 enters the scene during the 3-week circulation period of capital I if we consider the two as independent capitals, then the annual turnover presents itself according to the following schema. Fable II. The production process proceeds uninterruptedly on the same scale throughout the whole year. Here we have kept the two capitals I and II completely separate. But in order to present them separately in this 348, the turnover of capital table 2 capital I, £600 turnover period, weeks, 1910, 18, 19, 27, 28, 36, 37, 45, 46, 54. I23 IV versus V. Working period, weeks, 1610, 15, 19, 24, 28, 33, 37, 42, 46, 51. Additional capital II, £300 turnover period, working period, weeks. Weeks, I. 7 to 15. 7, 9, E, 1624. 1618, IE, 2533. 2521, 4, 34, 42. 34 to 36 volts, 43 to 51. 43 to 45. Advance in pound circulation period, weeks, 7, 9, 16, 18, 25, 21, 34, 36, 43, 45, 52 to 54. 600 quadrillion, 600 trillion, 600 billion, 600 million, 600,000, 600. Advance in pound circulation period, weeks, 300. 1015, 300. 1924, 300. 2833, 300. 3742, 300. 46 to 51 way, we have had to cut through their actual intersections and entanglements. According to the above table, for instance, the amounts turned over would be capital I5FX 600 equals £3,400, capital 25 times 300 equals £1,500 for the total capital, 5TX 900 equals £4,900. This is not correct, however, since, as we shall see, the actual product Tion and circulation periods do not entirely coincide with those in the above table, in which the important thing was to exhibit the two capitals I and II in complete independence from one another. In reality, for instance, capital 2 does not have working and circulation periods separate from those of capital I. The working period is 6 weeks, the circulation period 3 weeks. Since capital II is only £300, it can serve for only part of a working period. This is in fact the case. At the end of week 6, a product to the value of £600 steps out into circulation, and at the end of week 9 this value returns in money. Capital 2 thus moves into action at the beginning of week 7, and covers the needs of the next working period for weeks 7 to 9. According to our assumption, however, the working period is only half finished. Effective circulation time on the magnitude of capital advanced 349 by the end of week 9. The capital I of £600 that has just returned therefore moves into action once more, and £300 of it meets the advance needed for weeks 10 to 12. The second working period is thus taken care of. A product to the value of £600 is in circulation and will return at the end of week 15. On top of this, however, £300, the amount of the original capital 2, is set free and can function in the first half of the following working period, i.e. weeks 13 to 15. MTER this has elapsed, the £600 then returns once again. £300 of it suffices until the close of the working period, while £300 remains free for the following period. The matter now stands as follows. Turnover period I. Weeks 1 to 9 first working period, weeks 1 to 6. Capital I of £600 functions. First circulation period, weeks 7 to 9. At the end of week 9, £600 returns. Turnover period 2. Weeks 7 to 15 second working period, weeks 7 to 12. First half, weeks 7 to 9. Capital 2 of £300 functions. At the end of week 9, £600 returns in money. Capital I, second half, weeks 10 to 12. £300 of capital I functions. The other £300 of capital I remains free. Second circulation period, weeks 13 to 15. At the end of week 15, £600 returns in money, formed half from capital I, half from capital II. Turnover period III. Weeks 13 to 21 third working period, weeks 13 to 18. First half, weeks 13 to 15. The £300 set free begins to function. At the end of week 15, £600 returns in money. Second half, weeks 16 to 18. Of the £600 that has returned, £300 functions, the other £300 again remains free. Third circulation period, weeks 19 to 21. At its close, £600 again returns in money. In this £600, capital I and capital II have now merged indistinguishably together. In this way we have 8 full turnover periods of a capital of £600 up till the end of the 51st week, I. Weeks 1 to 9, 2, 7 to 15, 3, 13 to 21, IV, 19 to 27, V, 25 to 33, V, 31 to 39, 7, 37 to 45, 8, 43 to 51. But since weeks 49 to 51 fall in the 8th circulation period, the £300 of capital set free must enter production and keep it going during this time. The turnover thus presents itself as follows at the end of the year. £600 has £350 the turnover of capital completed its circuit 8 times, making £4,800 turned over. On top of this there is the product of the final 3 weeks, 49 to 51, but this has accomplished only a third of its 9-week circuit, and thus counts only for a third of its total amount, £100, in the sum turned over. So if the annual product of 51 weeks is £5,100, the capital turned over is only 4,800 plus 100 equals £4,900. The total capital advanced was £900, and this has therefore turned over 5t times, i.e. slightly less than in case I in the present example. We assumed a case in which the working time was 2/3 of the turnover period, and the circulation time 1/3, The working time was a simple multiple of the circulation time. The question arises where the setting free of capital noted above also occurs when this is not the case. Let us take a working period of 5 weeks and a circulation time of 4 weeks, with a capital advance of £100 per week. Turnover period I. Weeks 1 to 9 first working period, weeks 1 to 5. Capital I of £500 functions. First circulation period, weeks 6 to 9. At the end of week 9, £500 returns in money. Turnover period II. Weeks 6 to 14 second working period, weeks 6 to 10. First section, weeks 6 to 9. Capital II of £400 functions. At the end of week 9, capital I of £500 returns in money. Second section, week 10. £100 out of the returned £500 funct-ions. The remaining £400 stays free for the following working period. Second circulation period, weeks 11 to 14. At the end of week 14, £500 returns in money. Up till the end of week 14, weeks 11 to 14, the £400 that has been set free functions. £100 of the £500 that has then returned meets the remaining needs of the third working period, weeks 11 to 15, so that a further £400 is set free for the fourth working period. The same phenomenon is repeated in each working period. At its beginning, there is £400 available, which suffices for the first 4 weeks. At the end of the fourth week, £500 returns in money, and only £100 of this is needed for the final week, the remaining £400 being free until the next working period. Let us now take a working period of 7 weeks, with capital I of £700, and a circulation time of 2 weeks with capital II of £200. The first turnover period then lasts from week 1 to week 9, and out of effective circulation time on the magnitude of capital advanced 351. This period, the first working period, comprises weeks 1 to 7, with an advance of £700, while the first circulation period comprises weeks 8 to 9. At the end of the 9th week, the £700 returns in money. The second turnover period, weeks 8 to 16, includes the second working period of weeks 8 to 14. The needs of weeks 8 and 9 are met by capital II. At the end of the 9th week, the above £700 returns. £500 of this is used up by the end of the working period, weeks 10 to 14. There remains £200, which is set free for the next working period. The second circulation period covers weeks 15 to 16. At the end of week 16, a further £700 returns. The same phenomenon is now repeated in each working period. The capital needs of the first 2 weeks are met by the £200 set free at the close of the previous working period. At the end of the second week, £700 returns, but the working period now has only a further 5 weeks to run, so that only £500 can be used, and there is always £200 set free for the next working period. It emerges, therefore, that in our present example, where the working period is taken as greater than the circulation period, there is always set free at the close of each working period, under all circumstances, a money capital of the same magnitude as the capital II, which was advanced for the circulation period. In our 3 examples, capital II was £300 in the first, £400 in the second and £200 in the third, and the capital set free at the close of the working period was accordingly £300, £400 and £200. 3. Working period shorter than circulation period. We again start with a turnover period of 9 weeks. The working period is now 3 weeks, the capital I required for this being £300. The circulation period is 6 weeks. For these 6 weeks an additional capital of £600 is needed, which we can however divide up again into 2 capitals of £300, each of these catering for 1 working period. We then have 3 capitals of £300 each, with £300 always occupied in production, while £600 circulates, table 3. Here we have the exact counterpart of case I, with the simple distinction that 3 capitals now relieve one another instead of 2. There is no intersection or entanglement between the capitals. Each individual capital can be separately traced right through to the end of the year. Just as little as in case I, therefore, is any capital set free at the close of a working period. Capital I is completely laid out by the end of week 3, 352. The turnover of capital table 3. Capital I turnover period, working period, circulation period, weeks.
UX I19, 1.3.
4, 9, E, 1, 1, 8.
10 минус 12.
1, 3, 1, 8, IE, 1, 9, 2, 7.
19-21.
2, 2, 2, 7, 4, 2, 8, 3, 6.
28-30. 31-36 В 37-45, 37-39, 40-45 VI, 46-54, 46-48,
49, 54, capital 2 turnover period, working period, circulation period, weeks. Weeks.
UX, I, 4-12, 4-6,
712 E, 1321.
13-15,
1621 IE, 2230.
22-24,
2530 4, 3139.
31-33, 34-39 В 40-48, 40-42, 43-48 VI, 49-57, 49-51, 52-57, Capital II Turnover Period, Working Period, Circulation Period, UX,
Weeks.
UX, I, 7-15, 7-9,
1015 E, 1624.
16-18,
1924 IE, 2533.
25-27,
2833 4, 3442.
34-36, 37-42 В 43-51, 43-45,
46 to 51 completely returns at the end of week 9, and begins to function again at the start of week 10. Similarly with capitals 2 and 3. The even and complete replacement of the capitals excludes the setting free of any part of them. The overall turnover is calculated as follows. Turnover by capital I £300 x 5F equals £1,700. £2 300 by 5T equals £1,600. £300 times 5 equals £1,500 turned over by the total capital £900 x 5T equals £4,800. Effective circulation time on the magnitude of capital advanced 353. We shall now take an example in which the circulation period is not an exact multiple of the working period, i.e. a working period of 4 weeks, a circulation period of 5 weeks. The corresponding sums of capital are thus capital I equals £400, capital 2 equals £400, capital 3 equals £100. The table only gives the first 3 turnovers.
TABL Capital I Turnover Period, Working Period, Circulation Period, UX,
Weeks.
UX, I, 1-9, 1-4,
59 E, 917.
9, 10-12,
1317 IE, 1725.
17, 18-20, 21-25 Capital II Turnover Period, Working Period, Circulation Period, UX,
Weeks.
UX, I, 5-13, 5-8,
913 E, 1321.
13, 14-16,
1721 IE, 2129.
21, 22-24, 25-29 Capital II Turnover Period, Working Period, Circulation Period, UX,
Weeks.
UX, I, 9-17, 9,
1017 E, 1725.
17,
1825 IE, 2533.
25,
26 to 33. Here the capitals are intertwined in so far as the working period of capital 3, which does not have an independent working period of its own, since it is sufficient only for 1 week, coincides with the first working week of capital I. For this reason, however, a capital of £100, equal to capital 3, is set free at the close of the working periods of both capitals I and 2. If, for instance, capital 3 serves for the first week of the second and all subsequent working periods of capital I, and at the close of this first week the entire capital I of £400 returns, then the remainder of the working period of capital I amounts only to 3 weeks, and the corresponding capital outlay is £300. The £100 set free in this way then suffices for the first week of the directly following working period of capital 2. At the close of this week the entire capital 2 of £400 returns, but since the working period which is in progress can absorb only £300, there remains at its close, once again, £100 set free, 354 the turnover of capital, and so on. Capital is thus set free at the close of the working period whenever the circulation time is not a simple multiple of the working period, and this capital that is set free is moreover equal to the portion of capital which has to fill in for the excess of the circulation period over a working period or over a number of working periods. It has been assumed in all the cases investigated that both working time and circulation time remain the same throughout the year in the business under consideration, whatever it may be. This assumption was necessary if we wish to establish the influence of the circulation time on the turnover and on the capital advanced. It is beside the point here that this is not unconditionally the case in reality, and often not at all so. In this whole part, we are considering only the turnovers of circulate-in capital, and not those of fixed capital. This is for the simple reason that the matter under consideration does not involve the fixed capital. The means of labor, etc. that are applied in the production process only form fixed capital to the extent that the time during which they are in use extends longer than the turnover period of the fluid capital, Insofar as the time during which these means of labor endure and serve for constantly repeated labor processes is greater than the turnover period of the fluid capital, L covers a number n of turnover periods of this fluid capital. Whether the overall interval which is formed by these n turnover periods of the fluid capital is longer or shorter, the part of the productive capital that is advanced for this time in the form of fixed capital is not advanced again within the same interval. It goes on functioning in its old use form. The difference is simply that, according to the differing length of the individual working period in each turnover period of the fluid capital, the fixed capital surrenders a greater or smaller part of its original value to the product of this working period, and, according to the duration of the circulation time in each turnover period, this portion of the value of the fixed capital that is given up to the product returns more quickly or more slowly in the money form. The nature of the object of investigation in this part, the turnover of the circulating part of the productive capital, arises from the nature of this portion of the capital itself. The fluid capital applied in one working period cannot be applied in a new working period before it has completed its turnover, i.e. has been transformed into commodity capital, from the latter into money capital, and then back again into productive capital. In order to follow the first working period directly with the second, therefore, new capital must be advanced, and in sufficient quantity to fill the gaps that arise as a result of the circulating. Effective circulation time on the magnitude of capital advanced 355 period of the fluid capital that is advanced for the first working period. Hence the influence of the length of the working period of the fluid capital on the scale of the labor process and on the division of the capital advanced, or on the addition of new portions of capital. This, however, is precisely what we are considering in this part. 4. Resul ts. The above investigation leads to the following results. The various portions in which the capital has to be divided, so that one part of it can always be in its working period while other parts are in their circulation period, relieve each other, like independent private capitals, in two cases. 1. If the working period is equal to the circulation period, and the turnover period is thus divided into two equal sections. 2. If the circulation period is longer than the working period, but is a simple multiple of it, so that one circulation period equals n working periods, where n must be a whole number. In these cases, no part of the capital successively advanced is set free. B. However, in all cases where 1. The circulation period is greater than the working period, without forming a simple multiple of it, or 2. The working period is greater than the circulation period, a part of the overall fluid capital is always periodically set free at the close of each working period. This capital that is set free, moreover, is equal to the portion of the total capital that is advanced for the circulation period, if the working period is greater than the circulation period, and equal to the portion of capital which has to stand in for the excess of the circulation period over a working period or a whole number of working periods, if the circulation period is greater than the working period. See, it follows from this that as far as the total social capital is concerned, considering the fluid part of this, the setting free of capital is the rule, while the simple mutual replacement of portions of capital functioning successively in the production process must form the exception. For the equality of working period and circulation period, or the equality of circulation period and a whole number of working periods, in other words a regular proportion between the two components of the turnover period, has nothing at all to do with the nature of the case, and can therefore occur, by and large, only exceptionally. A very significant portion of the social circulating capital, which is turned over several times in the year, will thus periodically exist in the course of the annual turnover cycle in the form of capital set free. 356. The turnover of capital. It is also evident that, assuming that all other circumstances remain the same, the magnitude of this capital set free will grow with the extent of the labor process or the scale of production, and thus with the development of capitalist production in general. In case B, 2, simply because the overall capital advanced grows, in B, 1, for the same raison, and because the length of the circulation period also grows with the development of capitalist production, while the circulation period is not a simple multiple of the working period. In the first case, for example, there was £100 to be laid out each week. This made £600 for a 6-week working period, and £300 for a 3-week circulation period, making a total of £900. Here, £300 was always set free. If however £300 was laid out each week, then this would make £1,800 for the working period and £900 for the circulation period, and so £900 would be periodically set free instead of £300. D. The total capital of e.g. £900 must be divided up into two portions, in the above case £600 for the working period, and £300 for the circulation period. The portion that is actually laid out in the labor process will therefore diminish by a third, from £900 to £600, and hence the scale of production will also be reduced by a third. The £300, on the other hand, only functions to make the working period continue, so that in each week of the year £100 can be laid out in the labor process. Taken abstractly, it is all the same whether £600 operates for 6 times 8 equals 48 weeks, product equals £4,800, or whether the entire capital of £900 is laid out for 6 weeks in the labor process and then lies idle for a circulation period of 3 weeks. In the latter case it would operate for 32 weeks, equals 5t(x)(6), out of a total of 48, product equals 5t(x)(900) equals £4,800, and lie idle for 16 weeks. But apart from the greater waste of fixed capital during the idle period of 16 weeks, and the increased cost of labor, which has to be paid for the whole year even if only a part of this is worked, A regular interruption of this kind in the production process would be incompatible with the running of modern large-scale industry. Continuity is itself a productive force of labor. If we now look more closely at the capital that is set free, or in actual fact suspended, it is clear that a significant part of this must always possess the form of money capital. Let us stick to the example of the working period of 6 weeks and the circulation period of 3 weeks, weekly outlay £100. In the middle of the second working period, at the end of week 9, £600 returns, of which only £300 has to be laid out due. Effective circulation time on the magnitude of capital advanced 357 in the remainder of the working period. At the end of the second working period, therefore, £300 of this is set free. In what state does this £300 exist? We shall assume that 1/3 of it is laid out on wages, and 2/3 on raw and ancillary materials. Of the £600 that has returned, £200 thus exists in the money form for wages, and £400 in the form of a productive stock, i.e. as elements of the constant circulating productive capital. But since only half of this productive stock is required for the second half of working period 2, the other half exists for 3 weeks in the form of surplus productive stock, i.e. surplus to the needs of one working period. The capitalist, however, knows that, out of the portion of capital that has returned to him, £400, he needs only 1/2 for the current working period. It will therefore depend on the market conditions whether he immediately transforms this £200 completely or partially back into surplus productive stock, or hangs onto it wholly or partly as money capital, in the expectation of more favorable market conditions. It is self-evident, on the other hand, that the part to be laid out on wages, £200, is kept in the money form. The capitalist cannot dispose of labor power, once he has bought it, as he can the raw material in his storeroom. He has to incorporate it into the production process and pay for it at the end of the week. Of the capital of £300 that has been set free, therefore, this £100 will in any case possess the form of money capital that has been set free, i.e. is not needed for the working period. The capital set free in the form of money capital must therefore at least be equal to the variable portion of the capital that laid out on wages. At the maximum, it can include the whole of the capital set free. In reality, it constantly fluctuates between the minimum and the maximum. This money capital that is set free simply by the mechanism of the turnover movement, together with the money capital set free by the successive reflux of the fixed capital and that needed for variable capital in every labor process, must play a significant role, as soon as the credit system has developed, and must also form one of the foundations for this. Let us assume in our example that the circulation time is cut from 3 weeks to 2. This is not a normal occurrence, but may be an effect of a good period for business, shortened terms of payment, etc. The capital of £600 that was laid out during the working period returns 1 week earlier than needed, and is therefore set free for this week. £300, part of that £600, is again set free, as before, in the middle of the working period, but for 4 weeks now instead of 3. Hence £600 358. The turnover of capital exists on the money market for 1 week, and £300 for 4 weeks instead of 3. Since this does not just affect one single capitalist, but rather several, and occurs at different periods in different branches of industry, a greater quantity of disposable money capital is thereby brought onto the market. If this state of affairs lasts a long time, production will be expanded. Where circumstances permit, capitalists who operate with borrowed capital will exert less demand on the money market, which relieves it as much as does increased supply. Alternatively, the sums that have become superfluous for the turnover mechanism will eventually be definitively thrown out onto the money market. As a result of the contraction of the circulation time from 3 to 2 weeks, and hence of the turnover period from 9 weeks to 8, 1/9 of the total capital advanced becomes superfluous. The 6-week working period can now be kept going just as steadily with £800 as it could before with £900. A portion of the commodity capital, £100, therefore, once it is turned back into money, persists in this state as money capital, and no longer functions as a part of the capital advanced for the production process. While production is continued on the same scale and with conditions such as prices, etc. remaining otherwise the same, the value of the capital advanced declines from £900 to £800. The remaining £100 of the value originally advanced is precipitated out in the form of money capital. As such, it enters the money market and forms an additional part of the capital functioning there. We can see from this how a surfeit of money capital can arise. And not only in the sense that the supply of money capital is greater than the demand for it, the latter is never more than a relative surplus, which is found for instance in the depressed period that opens the new Boussinesq cycle after the crisis is over. It is rather in the sense that a definite part of the capital advanced is superfluous for the overall process of socia, reproduction, which includes the circulation process, and is therefore precipitated out in the form of money capital. It is thus a surplus which has arisen with the scale of production and prices remaining the same, simply by a contraction in the turnover period. The mass of money in circulation, whether this is larger or smaller, does not have the slightest influence on this. Let us assume, inversely, that the circulation period is extended, say from 3 weeks to 5. Then, when the next turnover takes place, the reflux of the capital advanced is already 2 weeks too late. The last part of the production process of this working period cannot be completed simply through the turnover mechanism of the capital original L. Effective circulation time on the magnitude 0, capital advanced 359 advanced. If the situation continues for much longer, there will be a contraction of the production process, i.e., a reduction of the scale on which it is conducted, just as in the previous case there was an expansion. In order to continue the process on the same scale, the capital advanced would have to be increased by I equals 200 pounds for the entire duration to cope with this prolongation of the circulation period. This additional capital can be obtained only from the money market. If the prolongation of the circulation period affects one or more major lines of business, then it may exert pressure on the money market, if this effect is not cancelled out by counter effect from another direction. In this case too, it is manifestly evident that this pressure, just like the surplus in the previous case, has nothing to do with a change either in the prices of commodities or in the quantity of the available means of circulation. The preparation of this chapter for publication has involved no small difficulties. Despite Marx's firm grasp of algebra, he was never at ease in reckoning with figures, i.e. in commercial calculations, even though there is a thick sheaf of notebooks in which he worked through all the various kinds of commercial calculation in several examples. But knowledge of the proper rules of calculation is not at all the same thing as exercise in the everyday practical calculations of the trader, and in his turnover calculations Marx became confused, with the result that, apart from being incomplete, they contain many errors and contradictions. In the tables reproduced above I have retained only the simplest and the arithmetically correct calculations, mainly for the following reason. The uncertain results of this tiresome calculation business led Marx to ascribe an undeserved significance to what in my opinion is in fact a matter of little importance. I refer to what he calls the setting free of money capital. The real question involved, on the assumptions made above, is this: no matter what the ratio between the length of the working period and the circulation time may be, and thus between capital I and capital II, once the first turnover has occurred there returns to the capitalist, at regular intervals equal in length to the working period, the capital needed for one such working period. Thus a sum equal to capital I if the working period is 5 weeks, the circulation time 4 weeks, and capital I 500 pounds, then a sum of 500 pounds flows back each time, at the end of weeks 9, 14, 19, 24, etc. If the working period is 6 weeks, the circulation time 3 weeks, 360 the turnover of capital and capital I 600 pounds, then 600 pounds flows back at the end of weeks 9, 15, 21 t 27, 33, etc. Finally, if the working period is 4 weeks, the circulation time 5 weeks, capital I 400 pounds, then the reflux of 400 pounds follows at the end of weeks 9, 13, 17, 21, 25, etc. Whether and to what degree this capital that has returned is superfluous for the current working period, and is thus set free, makes no difference. It is assumed that production proceeds uninterruptedly on the existing scale, and, for this to occur, money must be present, and thus flow back, whether it is set free or not. If production is interrupted, then this setting free comes to an end. In other words, there is in any case a release of money, a formation of latent, only potential capital, in the money form. But this happens in all circumstances, and not only under those particular conditions specified in the text. It happens, moreover, to a greater extent than that assumed in the text. In relation to circulating capital I, the industrial capitalist finds himself, at the end of each turnover, in precisely the same situation as when he set up his business. He has this capital completely in his hands once more, and at one go, while he can only gradually transform it again into productive capital. The main thing in the text is the proof that a considerable part of industrial capital is always present in the money form, while a still more considerable part must assume this form from time to time. This proof is reinforced, if anything, by these additional remarks of mine. Fe. 5. Effective changes in price. We have so far assumed that prices in the scale of production stay the same, while there is a contraction or expansion in the circulation time. Let us now assume, by way of contrast, a constant turnover period and a constant scale of production, but a change in price, i.e. a fall or rise in the price of raw materials, ancillaries and labor, or of the first two of these elements. Let us say that the price of raw materials and ancillaries falls by a half. In our example, only 50 pounds would then be needed each week instead of 100 pounds, and 450 pounds for the 9-week turnover period instead of 900 pounds. 450 pounds of the capital value advanced will at first be precipitated out as money capital, but the production process will be continued on the same scale, with the same turnover period and the same division within this. The annual product will remain the same in volume. Effective circulation time on the magnitude of capital advanced 361, but its value will fall by 1/2. It is neither an accelerated circulation that has led to this, nor a change in the quantity of money in circulation, but it is still accompanied by change in the supply of and demand for money capital. The converse is also true. The initial effect